Hi everybody, it's Nikki Chanel here and welcome to the first ever video of the Glam Historian series. Now, since this is the first video, I figured I should give a little bit of an intro to talk about why I'm talking about battleships, as you can see from the title. Now, I've been into history ever since I was a little kid, and World War II has always been on the top of that interest list. Like, it's just something crazy about that event, and it's just wild how it affects the modern day and it affects just everything. And there's so many connections you can make to it, like so many sci-fi events relate back to World War II events. There has been so many things that relate back to this conflict. And one of the things that I always was super interested about World War II was the naval engagements. And ever since I saw the old 1960s movie Sink the Bismarck when I was 9 years old, I was hooked. I wanted to know everything about battleships. I wanted to know everything about the naval wars. I wanted to learn everything. And so over the last, 20 years of being alive, I have learned every single thing there is to know about battleships, and I want to share that with you. And I figured the best way to do that is to start with a pretty simple video of my top 5 battleships of the Second World War. Now, some of these battleships are going to be seen in tons of other lists because there's just those legendary ships of World War II that grip the imagination like to no avail. And this video would be no different. We're going to be talking about probably some of the big names, and you could probably comment down which ones we're going to be talking about before you even get to them. But this is going to be the first video of a whole series of World War II topic videos that I want to do, where I really go into detail about these events, about these ships, about the people that served on them, some really interesting stories about the people that built them and did everything. And so I figured, to me, this is why I wanted to make a YouTube channel, is to talk about stuff that I truly have an interest in. Now, let's get into the video. However, these ships are legendary and some of their service records go for years and decades. I'm not going to be able to cover everything in a 20-something minute video. And so if there's anything more you would like to add down in the comment section, please add it. And I'm also going to be doing a video in the future about each of these ships in detail. I just want to make sure that I have the production value and the editing skills to give these ships justice. And so without further ado, let's get into my top 5 battleships of the Second World War. Okay, now what is a battleship? This is for everybody who clicked on this video and was like, okay, what is a battleship? So a battleship is essentially a large steel armored warship designed to fight in what is called a line of battle. Think of movies like the Pirates of the Caribbean. You have a good example of that, where you have 2 ships sailing with each other, opening fire on one another. And the ship that can survive the most damage and dish out the most damage is the winner. And so the battleship is really the continuation of 1800s cannon naval engagements, where those ships fought about 1,000 feet apart from each other, where battleships, in some of the record shots of battleships, they're shooting 16 miles away from each other, basically firing Volkswagen Beetles at each other. And that's essentially what a battleship is a massive steel warship designed to fight in a line of battle. Now, the other reason battleships came about was when they were built, this is the age of imperialism. This is the age of colonies spread all over the planet. You have these great powers of Europe, and you have this age of empire. And the battleship was essentially how you were going to keep your colony. And this really comes about because of a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by US Admiral Alfred Mahan, where he basically says is that to be a world power, you need a massive navy, and the battleship is one of the key elements of those navies. Now, the battleship is that. It is designed to fight this massive battle where if war broke out between these powers, you were going to have this one massive, beyond Armageddon style battle where one side's going to win and the other side loses and the war is over. And you see that in one famous engagement, such as the Battle of Tsushima. Now, the Russo-Japanese War continued way before this and continued after this. However, the Battle of Tsushima is a great example where the Japanese Navy completely obliterates the Russian Navy in a more or less one-sided engagement, and leading to the Treaty of Portsmouth and the Japanese winning the war. Now, that is probably one of the only examples of this actually happening ever, because the problem was that during this time of the age of battleships and this age of empires, you have a lot of technological innovation going on at this time. This is the Industrial Revolution. You have the introduction of torpedoes, you have the introduction of submarines, you have the introduction of bombs, you have the introduction of airplanes being a big one. And so the battleship's time was pretty much ended before it began. Now we have the benefit of history and foresight, knowing that all of these technological influences pretty much doomed the battleship from the very beginning. And there's a lot of instances in World War I and World War II where a battleship was taken down by a relatively mundane object. And these are massive ships crewed by thousands of people, sunk by a single plane with a bomb. That's a big cost to loss ratio right there. However, Navy still built these ships in the hopes of winning that decisive battle. However, as we see through history, there was only maybe 1 to 2 examples of this decisive battle ever happening, and some of these warships that I'm talking about are direct descendants of these naval tactics, of these naval plans, where these ships were designed to battle in this massive naval engagement. So on to ship number 1, the Bismarck. Now this should come as no surprise. The Bismarck is probably one of the most legendary ships of the Second World War, if not of all time. It is a massive steel battleship, 56,000 tons, 860 feet long, designed to win the German Navy dominance of the seas. Legendary ship, legendary engagement. Now in reality, the Bismarck was actually more of a cost-inefficient ship. It was kind of a waste of money. When looking at how the U-boats performed versus the German surface fleet, the U-boats were the definite winner in that argument. Now the Bismarck was built along with the new German naval rearmament plan of Plan Z, with the idea of rebuilding the German Navy after the loss suffered in the First World War, especially after most of the German fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow. Now, the Bismarck took the lessons learned from the First World War, as well as the Battle of Jutland, as well as some of the better German battleships of the First World War, such as SMS von der Tann, and turned it into a very heavily armed ship. Now, the Bismarck was impressively armored. However, its main guns was actually smaller than some of the calibers of the ships at the time, such as the Nagato and some of the American battleships. Now, the thing that makes the Bismarck super famous is not its extremely short service history, it's just its one operational engagement, known as Operation Runeberg, or also colloquially known as the sinking of the Bismarck. Now, the sinking of the Bismarck is one of those epic tales of World War II that I can't get into it because there's so many twists and turns, but the short version is that the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were sent to go repeat the successes of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in 1940 and decided to launch an attack on Allied convoys. Now, they didn't find any convoys. Instead, they stumbled upon the HMS Hood and the HMS Prince of Wales, ending up in the Battle of the Denmark Strait with the HMS Hood exploding out of nowhere, supposedly from a shell from the Bismarck, hitting one of the armor belts of the ship, punching through and detonating in one of the magazines, splitting the hood in half and sinking it. Bismarck takes some damage in the battle and returns home. Winston Churchill gives the famous remark, "Sink the Bismarck at all costs," and the Bismarck is hunted down over the next 4 days in just one of those epic World War II battles that I can't get into because there's just so much into it, and it's just such an amazing thing. But the Bismarck was caught and then sunk. And that's essentially the story of the Bismarck. Just the crazy battle of the sinking of the Bismarck is just one of the epic moments of the Second World War. It's just one of those like crazy events where a twist and turn happens, but the Bismarck was crippled by a torpedo fired by a ferry swordfish, and the ferry swordfish alone deserves a video in and of itself. And the Bismarck, simply put, didn't really do much. It really didn't. Its sister ship arguably was more successful as a fleet in being in Norway, but the Bismarck ended up being one of those legendary ships of the Second World War that the legend has kind of outweighed what it actually was in real life. On to our second ship, the Scharnhorst. Now, the Scharnhorst was another German battleship of the Second World War. However, compared to the Bismarck, the Scharnhorst did live up to its legend. It was a lucky ship. That's kind of the best way to describe it. The Scharnhorst was originally designed off the influences of World War I, and as part of the Plan Z, they were fast battleships relying on their speed. They could reliably hit 30 knots. However, they were armed with a smaller caliber of guns. They were only armed with 11-inch guns, which has kind of led to this weird classification in history circles where is it a battle cruiser, is it a battleship, is it a heavy cruiser, is it a fast battleship? However, when you look at the armor scheme and the speed, it definitely was more in that fast battleship category of the Second World War. Now, the Scharnhorst service record is epic. I'm not even gonna try to get into it because I won't be able to give the ship justice, basically. And the Scharnhorst was one of those ships that just survived. It had a lot of luck on its side. It was present at the sinking of the HMS Rawalpindi in the early stages of the Second World War. It sunk a lot of surface convoys in 1940. It was actually the success of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau raids against the Atlantic convoys actually led the German High Command to authorize Operation Runeberg, sending the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen out. Then it also sunk the HMS Glorious in kind of a weird encounter. The sinking of the Glorious has a lot of conspiracies to it, and I'm not going to try to get into that. And then the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were stuck in France for the better part of about a year after the Bismarck sortie was like, okay, we can't afford to send these battleships out, otherwise they're going to get hunted down and sunk. And so the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were laid up in France. However, they were under constant bombardment, and the idea was that they were going to be moved to Norway to hold off against an Allied invasion of Norway. There was a lot of planning. There was a lot of thinking in the German command that they were going to retake Norway. And so the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were sent on the famous Channel Dash right up the English Channel, right under the British noses. And the British didn't even know it was happening. And it's like the Channel Dash, you can see across. You could easily see the ships passing through at the narrowest point. And the Channel Dash, Operation Cerberus, is one of those crazy events that has a lot of conspiracy to it as well. But it's one of those events that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau got away lucky. They were barely attacked at all. And then sitting in Norway, the Scharnhorst didn't really do much. However, its final battle, the Battle of the North Cape, was really a plan to sink the German Navy. That was its plan, and the Scharnhorst was one of the ships that was caught. And the Battle of the North Cape is an epic multi-hour engagement in freezing cold conditions, and the sinking of the Scharnhorst is one of those great engagements of the Second World War that I'm hoping to talk about in the future, but I cannot give it that level of justice at my level of production capacity right now. However, the Scharnhorst is one of my favorite ships because its service record did live up to the legend, and it's not as well known as the Bismarck because there was no movies made about the Scharnhorst, but the Scharnhorst is one of those ships that needs to be in the history books. Now, onto our third ship, and as you might have guessed, the Yamato. Now, the Yamato is probably the most legendary ship of the Second World War. It is this massive steel gargantuan beast. It was 76,000 tons, the heaviest ship of the Second World War. She and her sister Musashi were the largest ships ever built on the planet Earth up until the USS Forrestal in the 1960s. Now, the Yamato is legendary. Its service record is not, and really the legend of the Yamato comes about because of multiple movies made about it, multiple animes made about it. There was the space battleship Yamato. The Yamato is legendary, but it didn't do much. In fact, it was almost worthless to build because the Japanese, by the time they got around to using it, were basically on the last end, and they just used it in desperate attacks, basically. And so the Yamato comes about because the Japanese had won the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. They had won the decisive naval action. And there was a lot of stuff happening in the 1930s. I'm not even going to try to get into the imperial expansion of the time, of the jingoist level of mentality around the time, the invasion of China. There was a lot of stuff, but there was also a lot of tension with the US. And this was leading Japan to this idea of that they were going to battle the US in a war for Pacific dominance. That was kind of what their thought process was. And they did not have the production capacity to beat the United States in a manufacturing war. They knew that from a very early standpoint. However, what they decided was, we are going to build a ship that would win us it regardless, or at least do extremely well at it. And so they poured all of their resources, all of their money into building the decisive war-winning ship. Now, the Yamato is weird, is that it was designed to just win this decisive battle. But the interesting thing is that the Japanese were also heavily influenced upon carrier development, especially after the Battle of Toronto in 1940, where this is kind of come as no surprise, where a British aircraft carrier full of planes attacked the Italian Navy at port. What does that sound like? That sounds like Pearl Harbor. And the Yamato kind of came about during the beginning stages of the aircraft carrier. The World War II in the Pacific cemented the aircraft carrier as the primary weapon of war moving forward, at least for naval engagements. It was the primary ship. And the Yamato was treated more of like a status symbol. They really couldn't afford to lose it. It was too expensive, it was too big. And so the ships just kind of sat there and did nothing for most of the war. Now, finally, once the aircraft carriers had been sunk after multiple engagements and the Japanese were kind of on their last leg, they decided to go all in during the American invasion of the Philippines and launch the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is massive. It was a multi-pronged attack, and I'm not even gonna try to get into the Battle of Leyte Gulf because it's just epic. That's the best way to describe it. Now, during the early stages of the battle, the Japanese combined fleet was attacked in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, thus losing the Musashi. The Musashi was sunk by a massive American air attack that sank the battleship in the Sibuyan Sea, and the Japanese turned around, but then they decided to turn back, caught the US Pacific Fleet on the back foot, and ran into a small force of ships that were like a covering force called Taffy 3. Now, the story of Taffy 3 is epic. And the Taffy 3 was a small fleet of escort ships, of escort destroyers. Their largest ship was a Fletcher. In fact, the Yamato weighed as much as every single ship in Taffy 3 combined. But Taffy 3 fought well above its weight. It punched way above its weight and completely annihilated the Japanese force. And the only time the Yamato actually fired its guns at an enemy ship was at the USS Johnson. In fact, they think that they found battle damage from the Musashi at the USS Johnson wreck site in the Pacific Ocean, which is really amazing. And it was because of this, Admiral Kurita, the leader of the combined fleet, was like, okay, we're fighting a much larger American force, we need to turn back. And so the Yamato turned back and ran for home. And the Yamato just kind of sat there. Japanese fuel reserves by the end of the war were basically eliminated. Most of their merchant navy was destroyed by the US submarines, and the Yamato was essentially sent on a kamikaze run at the Battle of Okinawa. And the ship was sent with enough fuel to get to Okinawa. It was told do as much damage and die honorably. And the ship never even made it to Okinawa. It was caught by a massive amount of US planes and sunk after receiving multiple bombs and torpedo hits, and exploded in a massive explosion that you could see for hundreds of miles away. And thus the Yamato was gone. So really, in the end, the Yamato actually did not do much. Just the legend of this massive, all-powerful ship, the symbol of the Japanese military, is really what has led to the legend of the Yamato spreading, especially with the anime and all the movies made about it. It's an epic ship and it looks great. So I think the ship looks amazing, but it just did not live up. Now on to a venerable British lady, HMS Warspite. Now, HMS Warspite is one of those ships that no one really knows unless you're like a diehard historian. Warspite does not have a movie made about it. It did not serve past World War II, but its service record in both the First World War and the Second World War easily put it into one of the best battleships of all time. Now, HMS Warspite was built as a Queen Elizabeth class super dreadnought in the First World War. That was seen as like a super upgun British battleship, some of the first ships in the world armed with 15-inch guns, and they served with massive distinction in the British Grand Navy. They were some of like the flagships of the fleet during the First World War, and they were all present at the Battle of Jutland. In fact, HMS Warspite suffered damage at Jutland, and one of its crew members, this is an interesting tidbit of history, one of its crew members suffered wounds in the attack, and he actually underwent one of the first instances of plastic surgery ever to fix some of his wounds suffered at Jutland on the HMS Warspite, which is an interesting little tidbit of history. Now, Warspite went on to continually serve in the British Navy in the interwar years. They were rebuilt in the 1930s, and then when World War II broke out, they were some of the ships that were involved. And the Queen Elizabeth class in the Second World War went through craziness, but the Warspite served with distinction during the Second World War. It was present at the Battle of Narvik. Now, the Battle of Narvik, unless you played, I think, Battlefield 5, where you can actually play in the Battle of Narvik in that game, and HMS Warspite was present at the Battle of Narvik. Now, the Battle of Narvik is a very interesting engagement where the Germans were invading Norway, and the British, in response to that invasion, sent a task force to occupy a Norwegian port named Narvik. And a couple of German destroyers were sent there to engage the British assault forces. And they originally sank 2 coastal patrol ships of the Norwegian, and then the British fleet came in, and the HMS Warspite versus German destroyers in a very small fjord. You can imagine how that went. There's a story about one German destroyer came about to do a torpedo attack, and all of Warspite's guns happened to be aimed at that one destroyer. and apparently the ship was completely thrown into the water from the blast of the guns hitting it. And the Warspite served with distinction. It was present at multiple battles in the Mediterranean. It was present at, I want to say it was present at D-Day, and then it considered shore bombardment. Like, the Warspite's service record was forever. Like, you name a big British battle of the First World War and the Second World War that involved battleships, and the Warspite was probably there. The Warspite's history is epic. Like, its story is crazy. Its legend is there. Like, it was a ship that was used aggressively. It fought aggressively. It was a beautiful ship in a lot of ways. It had that beautiful rebuilt command bridge. Like, Warspite was a good looking ship. However, in 1946, it ran aground on some shoals, and the ship was sold for scrap because it didn't really have a place in the modern era, and the British suffered a lot of economic troubles after the Second World War, and the Warspite was unfortunately sold to scrap, so it's not around anymore. But the Warspite's service record is pretty amazing when you start getting down to it. It served with distinction and is definitely one of the great British battleships. Now, with our last ship, this should come as no surprise, the USS Missouri. Now, the USS Missouri and the ships of the Iowa class truly live up to their legend. They were used well past their prime, and there's even some debate of using them today in the modern era, which is interesting. But the Missouri and the Iowa class battleships were fast battleships commissioned by the US Navy to fight against the new German and Japanese battleships that were being built. They were fast, they could go, I think top speed was like 33 knots. They were extremely fast, extremely well armored. They carried very similar guns to a lot of the other US warships at the time, such as the South Dakota class, the North Carolina class, and they were eventually going to lead into another ship called the Montana class, but that ship was never built because that was diverted to Essex class carriers. Now, the Iowa class were some of the last battleships commissioned by the US Navy, and their service record past the Second World War has led to them being amazing. Now, the Iowa class for much of the war never really did much. I think the Iowa might have engaged a light cruiser during the Battle of Truk. I think that's like the only time, but I've never really been able to confirm that part. So if anybody wants to confirm if the USS Iowa engaged a Japanese light cruiser at the Battle of Truk, please let me know. But the Missouri's most famous claim to fame is it was the site of the surrender of the Japanese during the Second World War in Tokyo Bay. It was where they signed the Instrument of Surrender. Now, the story of how the USS Missouri was picked really just kind of comes down to that it was the flagship of the fleet, and so it was chosen as the signing point of the signatory. And the Iowa-class battleships were put in the mothball after the Second World War, but were reactivated for the Korean War, served in the invasion of Incheon, deactivated after the North Korean War. The USS New Jersey was reactivated in Vietnam because of the loss of American fighter planes. The US Navy had the idea, hey, how about we send a battleship over there? The North Vietnamese probably can't sink that. And then New Jersey performed 1 to 2 tours of duty over there. They even had a swimming pool in one of the ships, which is interesting. And the New Jersey is still on display as well, which is awesome. And then the ships were deactivated, sat in mothball for 20 years, and then reactivated to fight against the new Soviet battle cruisers, the Kirov-class battle cruisers, as part of Reagan's 600-ship Navy. The Missouri and the Wisconsin, New Jersey, and the Iowa all went through a modernization program where they were armed with Tomahawk missiles. All of the old components were taken out and rebuilt, and in some instances I've read that the cost of rebuilding the USS Missouri to getting it up to 1980 standards was the cost of a new cruiser, basically. Like, they were expensive to rebuild. But apparently when they put out the call to service on them, they were inundated with people that wanted to serve on the ships that their father served on. They wanted to serve on the ships that their grandfather served on. This was arguably like probably one of the most interesting engagements for the battleship, is that the Missouri and the Wisconsin were sent to the Gulf War in 1991 during Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And they were sent there, and there's a lot of videos about the Missouri, and there's a lot of shots of the Missouri and the Wisconsin both engaged in war in 1991, 50 years after the Second World War. Isn't that amazing? Like, these ships lasted forever, and I think the reason they lasted forever was the reason that they could keep up with modern navies. They could actually like keep up to speed, and their shore bombardment tactics was what kept them in service for such a long time. Then finally in the late 90s, early 2000s, all the ships were decommissioned and all of them are now active museum ships in the US. USS Iowa is sitting in Los Angeles. USS Missouri is right across from USS Arizona, the site of the beginning of World War II for the US, started with a battleship and ended with a battleship for the US. And so both of the ships are right next to each other. USS Wisconsin is in Norfolk, Virginia, and USS New Jersey is in Camden, New Jersey, right across from Philly. Now, the Missouri is just epic. I can't even get into most of the ship because it's just such a long-term serving member of the US Navy. It's a relic of an old time that in a way it actually still works today because of just how old it is compared to new technology. The Iowa class battleships are venerable ships that somehow still have a place in the modern world. Hey everybody, thank you for watching that YouTube video. Now, battleships have always interested me ever since I was a little kid. Anything naval has always interested me. I've never been on a battleship, unfortunately. I've never even been on the ocean. I've only been on one museum ship, the USS Hornet in Alameda, California, and that was an amazing experience. Now, these battleships are some of the tiptoes. There's dozens of battleships from multiple countries. I could have mentioned other ships such as the Richelieu, the Jean Bart, the Nagato, the Hiei, the Kirishima, the South American battleships, the North Carolina, the Washington, and South Dakota. Like, I can talk all day about battleships because they've just always had an interest in me. The stories of the men serving on board these ships, the stories that they went through, the battles that they went through, the crazy moments down to the little moments. Now, I love these ships. I think every single one of them is epic. I love all of the battleships of the Second World War. They were built as tools of war, but they had those moments that almost made them human in a lot of ways. All of the stories of the people serving on board them, the camaraderie. I had a grandfather who served on the USS New Mexico during the Second World War, and that was a pretty cool experience talking to him about that. And unfortunately, I was too young to really talk to a lot of these veterans because unfortunately they're passing away as age catches up with them. And I hope to keep talking about the stories of the battleships. I hope you like this video. I would love to do more World War II videos. I would love to do more World War II naval videos, and hopefully in the future build up these production values so I can really give these ships the history and the dedication and the acknowledgement that they deserve. Now, thank you for watching that YouTube video. Please like and subscribe, put those comments in the comment section, hit the notification bell to never miss a video. Tell me what you think about this new direction for my channel. And this has been Nicky Chanel, and I will see you on the next one.